in this new story. For more than a century, the town of Hollow Creek, West Virginia, revolved around a small white church that stood on a hillside overlooking the river. Built in 1889 by coal miners and local farmers, St. Matthew's Church never impressed visitors with its size or architecture. Its wooden walls weathered countless winters, its narrow stained glass windows had been repaired more times than anyone could remember, and its bell tower leaned slightly to the east after surviving a lightning strike during the 1940s. Yet, every resident recognized one sound above all others. Every Sunday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the old bronze bell rang across the valley, echoing through forests and fields before fading into the surrounding mountains. It became so familiar that many longtime residents claimed they could tell the time without ever looking at a clock. Then, in the autumn of 1998, St. Matthew's Church was demolished. The congregation relocated to a larger building closer to town. The bell was removed, the timber salvaged, and within a week, nothing remained on the hill except an empty stone foundation. 2 months later, on an otherwise ordinary Sunday morning, the church bell rang again. No one paid much attention the first time. Several older residents assumed another nearby church had begun using a similar bell. Others believed they had simply imagined the familiar sound after decades of hearing it every week. Memory often lingered long after routines disappeared. But the following Sunday, at precisely 8 o'clock, the bell rang again. It lasted almost exactly 30 seconds, just as St. Matthew's bell always had. The sound drifted across Hollow Creek with the same deep metallic tone everyone recognized instantly. People stepped onto porches, looked toward the empty hill, and found nothing standing where the church had once been. The foundation remained bare beneath early morning fog. There was no tower, no bell, and no building capable of producing the sound they had all just heard. Within a month, nearly the entire town acknowledged the phenomenon. Shop owners paused while unlocking their businesses every Sunday morning. Families eating breakfast stopped speaking as the familiar chime rolled through the valley. Hunters camping several miles away later confirmed hearing the bell despite having no knowledge that a church had ever occupied the hillside. Even motorists passing along State Route 14 occasionally pulled onto the shoulder, believing a nearby service had begun. Every witness pointed toward the same location. The sound always seemed to originate from the empty hill where St. Matthew's had stood for 109 years. Pastor Daniel Mercer, who had overseen the congregation's move into the new church, initially dismissed the reports. He suggested the sound likely echoed from another valley under unusual weather conditions. The Appalachian Mountains frequently produced remarkable acoustic effects, carrying distant train whistles and factory sirens far beyond their normal range. To settle the matter, Mercer climbed the old church property one Sunday morning shortly before 8. Several parish members joined him, along with 2 county deputies, curious enough to witness the event themselves. They stood quietly upon the abandoned foundation as morning mist drifted between the trees. At exactly 8 o'clock, the bell rang. Every person present later agreed on one unsettling detail. The sound did not echo toward the hill. It echoed outward from directly beneath their feet. Several witnesses instinctively looked down at the weathered stone foundation, expecting to see hidden speakers or buried machinery. There was nothing. The ringing continued exactly 32 seconds before fading naturally into silence. No vibration passed through the ground. No mechanical device revealed itself. The deputies thoroughly searched the surrounding woods before concluding no practical source existed. County officials soon became involved, partly because curious visitors had begun gathering each Sunday to hear the mysterious bell for themselves. Engineers inspected the old foundation, searching for forgotten utility equipment capable of producing metallic vibrations. They discovered only the original limestone footings laid by local stonemasons during the 19th century. Metal detectors located scattered nails, rusted hinges, and fragments of stained glass buried beneath collapsed debris, but no trace of the bronze bell removed months earlier. Church records confirmed the bell itself had been installed inside the new sanctuary across town, where it remained suspended above the entrance exactly as expected. Inspectors rang it repeatedly while volunteers listened from the old hillside. The tones differed subtly. The new church bell sounded slightly higher after restoration. The mysterious Sunday ringing matched recordings of the original bell made before demolition. Curiosity eventually attracted researchers from a nearby university specializing in environmental acoustics. Their theory centered upon temperature inversions common throughout Appalachian valleys. Under specific atmospheric conditions, distant sounds could appear remarkably close while masking their true origin. For several consecutive Sundays, sensitive microphones and directional recording equipment surrounded the abandoned church site. The recordings captured the bell with astonishing clarity. Analysis confirmed the sound arrived equally from every direction at once, making triangulation impossible. Instead of traveling across the landscape like ordinary sound waves, the recording suggested the bell somehow emerged already surrounding the listeners. Physicists reviewing the data described the result as almost certainly caused by measurement limitations rather than anything extraordinary. None successfully identified another source. The oldest residents quietly offered their own explanations. 87-year-old Margaret Collins remembered attending St. Matthew's as a child before the Second World War. According to stories told by her grandfather, the church bell served a purpose beyond announcing Sunday services. During severe floods, coal mine accidents, or fires threatening nearby farms, the bell summoned every able-bodied resident, regardless of denomination. It had reportedly rung during nearly every major tragedy Hollow Creek ever endured. Margaret often wondered whether people had remembered the bell because it protected the town, or whether the town remembered to survive because it listened whenever the bell called. Most dismissed her words as poetic nostalgia rather than history. Everything changed during the spring of 2002. On the first Sunday in April, the bell rang at its usual time. Then, unexpectedly, it rang again just after midnight. The second ringing lasted far longer than normal. Residents later estimated nearly 2 full minutes. Confused telephone calls flooded the sheriff's office before anyone could determine a cause. Less than 3 hours later, an aging earthen dam 12 miles upstream partially failed after days of relentless rainfall. Emergency alerts forced much of Hollow Creek to evacuate before dawn. Floodwaters reached the edge of town by sunrise. No one died. Several elderly residents quietly pointed out that St. Matthew's bell had always rung during emergencies long before modern warning systems existed. County officials dismissed the timing as coincidence. Still, they documented the unusual midnight ringing alongside flood reports. Over the following decade, similar patterns gradually emerged. The bell rang unexpectedly before a devastating ice storm. Again, before a hillside collapsed onto an abandoned mining road. Again, during a forest fire that narrowly missed several homes. Each event possessed perfectly ordinary scientific explanations. Only the advance ringing remained unexplained. Seeking historical context, local historian Rebecca Nolan began examining handwritten parish records preserved since the church's founding. Most entries documented baptisms, weddings, funerals, and routine maintenance. One leather-bound ledger dating from 1891 contained several pages devoted entirely to the church bell. According to the anonymous writer, the congregation debated removing the bell shortly after installation because local residents repeatedly claimed hearing it ring before accidents occurred. The minister at that time reportedly insisted no miracle existed. Instead, he instructed parishioners never to discuss such stories publicly for fear of encouraging superstition. The final sentence beneath the faded ink stood apart from every other entry. Whether anyone believes it or not, the bell has never belonged to the tower. Rebecca never interpreted the passage as evidence of anything supernatural. She believed the unknown minister simply sought to comfort frightened parishioners during difficult years. Yet the phrase lingered in her mind whenever Sunday mornings arrived. The bell had never belonged to the tower. Perhaps it belonged to the people who listened. In 2015, engineers surveying the abandoned church property for a proposed memorial park made one final attempt to solve the mystery. Ground-penetrating radar examined the entire hillside, searching for forgotten structures, buried machinery, or unusual geological formations capable of influencing sound. The survey revealed only ordinary bedrock beneath several feet of soil. No hidden chamber, no underground tunnel, no evidence suggesting anything remained beneath the foundation except the earth itself. Construction of the memorial proceeded without incident. A simple stone marker now occupies the center of the old church site. Visitors often pause there on quiet Sunday mornings, reading the inscription describing St. Matthew's long history before continuing toward nearby hiking trails. Most hear nothing unusual. Some claim they hear a faint bell shortly before 8 o'clock, even on mornings when watches and phones insist the hour has not yet arrived. Today, the official position of Hollow Creek's local government remains unchanged. No verified source has ever been identified for the recurring bell reported by dozens of witnesses over more than 2 decades. Acoustic experts continue favoring natural explanations involving terrain and atmospheric conditions, despite acknowledging that no experiment has successfully reproduced the phenomenon. The congregation of St. Matthew's no longer discusses it during services, and younger residents often dismiss the story as harmless local folklore. Yet every Sunday, a handful of older townspeople still arrive at the abandoned hillside a few minutes before 8. They stand quietly among the wildflowers growing between the ancient stones, hats removed, eyes fixed upon the empty place where a church once stood. They never seem surprised when the valley fills with the unmistakable sound of a bronze bell that no longer exists, calling a town that still remembers exactly how it used to answer. In this new story, Red Hollow Road stretched less than 7 miles through the eastern hills of West Virginia, yet almost everyone living in Mercer County knew its name. The narrow 2-lane road wound between thick forests, abandoned coal camps, and steep ridges where sunlight disappeared hours before sunset. During the day, it looked no different from countless back roads scattered throughout Appalachia. Deer crossed without warning, old wooden bridges creaked beneath pickup trucks, and faded mailboxes leaned beside gravel driveways leading toward isolated farmhouses hidden among the trees. Visitors occasionally drove the road while exploring the mountains, usually forgetting about it before reaching the next county. Local residents, however, noticed something that had quietly remained unchanged for nearly 70 years. Every sheriff elected in Mercer County eventually developed the same habit. Whenever possible, they refused to patrol Red Hollow Road after dark. The strange pattern never appeared in campaign speeches or official county records. Newly elected sheriffs always insisted they would serve every community equally, regardless of distance or reputation. For the first several months, patrol schedules reflected those promises. Deputies responded to calls from every corner of the county without hesitation. Then, almost without exception, routine quietly changed. Nighttime patrol routes shifted, deputies handled calls near Red Hollow whenever possible, while the sheriff himself remained noticeably absent. If emergencies occurred elsewhere, the sheriff responded personally. If dispatchers reported suspicious activity somewhere along Red Hollow Road after sunset, responsibility almost always fell upon younger deputies. No written policy explained the arrangement. It simply became another unspoken tradition accepted by everyone inside the sheriff's office. Most people assumed the reason involved geography rather than mystery. Red Hollow Road twisted through some of the county's most isolated terrain, where radio signals frequently disappeared behind steep ridges and heavy snowfall often blocked access during winter. Wildlife collisions happened regularly. Flash flooding occasionally washed out sections of pavement after violent summer storms. Responding alone could become genuinely dangerous, especially at night when visibility dropped to almost nothing beneath dense tree cover. Retired deputies frequently described the road as exhausting rather than frightening. The explanation sounded reasonable enough that few people questioned it further. Yet, longtime dispatchers quietly noticed one detail that geography could never explain. Sheriffs willingly drove roads that were even more remote and difficult than Red Hollow. Only this particular stretch inspired consistent avoidance generation after generation. In the autumn of 2022, Daniel Brooks accepted the position of county sheriff after serving nearly 25 years with the West Virginia State Police. Calm, methodical, and deeply respected throughout the region, Brooks had built his career on solving problems through evidence rather than rumor. He openly dismissed local ghost stories whenever community meetings drifted toward folklore. Roads were dangerous because drivers became careless. Old buildings produced strange sounds because age altered wood and steel. Every unexplained event eventually revealed an ordinary cause if someone investigated patiently enough. Those beliefs earned him widespread trust during the election. Residents appreciated having a sheriff who relied upon facts rather than superstition. Brooks intended to patrol every mile of Mercer County himself before the first snowfall arrived, including Red Hollow Road. The road looked completely ordinary during daylight. Dense oak forests lined both sides, interrupted occasionally by abandoned farmhouses slowly disappearing beneath vines and collapsing barns whose rusted roofs reflected afternoon sunlight. Telephone poles followed the pavement into the hills before ending near an abandoned coal loading station closed since the early 1970s. A narrow creek flowed beside portions of the road, disappearing beneath old stone culverts built decades earlier by Civilian Conservation Corps workers. Brooks spent nearly 3 hours documenting damaged guardrails, faded road signs, and drainage problems requiring county maintenance. He found nothing unusual beyond the expected challenges facing rural infrastructure. When he returned to the sheriff's office, he quietly wondered why experienced law enforcement officers had spent decades treating such an ordinary road with unusual caution. His answer began arriving through conversations rather than evidence. Martha Collins, the county dispatcher for almost 38 years, remembered serving under 4 different sheriffs before Brooks took office. Without exaggeration, she recalled each sheriff making nearly identical requests after several months on the job. None ever instructed deputies to avoid Red Hollow Road completely. Instead, they simply preferred assigning nighttime calls there to someone else whenever circumstances allowed. Martha admitted that no sheriff had ever explained the decision. They merely stopped volunteering to drive the road after sunset. The similarity struck Brooks as unusual, particularly because the men involved differed dramatically in personality, background, and policing philosophy. Shared habits normally reflected shared experiences. Brooks intended to discover exactly what those experiences had been. Archived incident reports revealed no obvious pattern. Traffic stops occurred regularly, disabled vehicles received assistance, hunters occasionally reported lost hikers who were quickly located without injury. Minor accidents appeared no more frequent than elsewhere in the county. Violent crime remained remarkably rare. The only recurring detail involved dispatch logs rather than criminal investigations. Beginning as far back as surviving radio transcripts allowed, deputies repeatedly documented calls from motorists reporting a lone sheriff's cruiser parked beside the abandoned coal station shortly after midnight. Every caller described the vehicle similarly. Headlights remained on, emergency light bars stayed dark, the driver's door stood open. No deputy or sheriff appeared anywhere nearby. Dispatchers invariably attempted contacting whichever unit had supposedly been seen. Every time, records confirmed the referenced patrol vehicle had actually been operating somewhere else in the county at that exact moment. Brooks initially suspected mistaken identity. White patrol SUVs looked remarkably similar from a distance, particularly along dark rural roads. Yet several reports predated modern vehicles by decades, describing older sheriff sedans carrying entirely different markings. The details evolved alongside changing patrol cars while preserving one constant feature. Someone always reported an apparently abandoned sheriff's vehicle near the coal station. Someone always stopped to offer assistance. No one ever found the vehicle upon reaching the location. Patrol officers responding minutes later consistently discovered nothing beyond an empty roadside bordered by silent forest. Determined to settle the matter personally, Brooks scheduled a solo patrol one cold November evening, despite quiet objections from senior deputies. Shortly before midnight, he parked near the abandoned coal station overlooking the creek. The forest remained perfectly still beneath a clear sky crowded with stars. Wind barely stirred the treetops. His cruiser radio functioned normally despite occasional static common throughout the hills. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Brooks began considering the entire tradition little more than accumulated folklore reinforced through decades of expectation. Then, the dispatch radio crackled unexpectedly. Martha's familiar voice asked why he had requested emergency backup. Brooks immediately replied that he had made no transmission whatsoever. A long silence followed before Martha quietly answered that someone using his exact call sign had reported an officer down on Red Hollow Road less than 30 seconds earlier. Brooks checked every radio control inside the cruiser. No transmission indicator appeared. Recording equipment later confirmed his microphone had remained untouched. Before either he or dispatch could discuss the mystery further, another voice interrupted the channel. Calm, professional, unmistakably belonging to an experienced law enforcement officer, it repeated Brooks's own call sign before requesting immediate assistance at the abandoned coal station. This time, Brooks heard the transmission exactly as dispatch had. He stepped from the cruiser, expecting another deputy playing an elaborate prank. The empty road stretched silently in both directions beneath pale moonlight. No headlights approached, no engines echoed through the valley. Even the creek seemed unusually quiet. The voice returned one final time, sounding noticeably weaker than before, calmly repeating that backup was urgently needed before dissolving beneath loud static. Brooks searched the surrounding area until nearly 3 in the morning. Fresh frost covered the grass undisturbed except for his own footprints. The abandoned coal station remained exactly as county surveyors had documented years earlier. No hidden vehicles, abandoned equipment, or evidence of recent visitors appeared anywhere nearby. Returning to the sheriff's office before sunrise, Brooks reviewed radio recordings alongside dispatch staff. The mysterious transmissions had been captured clearly by every recording device connected to the county communication system. Audio specialists later confirmed the voice matched Brooks almost perfectly, despite originating from a radio microphone that had never transmitted. Engineers examined towers, repeaters, and dispatch equipment without discovering mechanical faults capable of generating such a phenomenon. The recordings remained impossible to explain through conventional means. Weeks later, Brooks interviewed retired Sheriff Harold Whitaker, who had served during the late 1980s. Whitaker listened quietly to the recordings before nodding almost immediately. Without surprise, he explained that every sheriff eventually heard the same radio calls. Some experienced them within weeks of taking office, others waited years. No one ever discovered their source. Whitaker admitted he had once spent 6 consecutive nights searching Red Hollow Road after hearing his own voice repeatedly request emergency assistance from the abandoned coal station. Each search ended exactly the same way. Empty pavement, silent forest, no patrol vehicle, no injured deputy. Eventually, he realized the calls never led toward anyone needing rescue. They only encouraged the sheriff to keep returning alone. From that night forward, he allowed younger deputies to handle routine patrols there while responding personally only if genuine emergencies could be independently confirmed. Sheriff Brooks never publicly acknowledged the conversation, nor did he issue formal restrictions regarding Red Hollow Road. Officially, patrol schedules continued exactly as before. Unofficially, experienced deputies noticed a familiar pattern quietly returning to the department. Brooks willingly responded anywhere in Mercer County, regardless of weather or time, except one narrow stretch of pavement winding through the hills beyond the abandoned coal station. If nighttime calls originated there, another unit usually arrived first while Brooks monitored events carefully from dispatch. Years later, newly hired deputies occasionally asked veteran officers why every sheriff seemed reluctant to patrol Red Hollow Road after sunset. The answer always remained the same. Nobody claimed the road was haunted. Nobody insisted supernatural forces lived among the trees. The older deputies simply explained that if a sheriff ever heard his own voice asking for help somewhere ahead in the darkness, experience suggested the safest decision was not to answer it. No official investigation ever produced a better explanation, and after more than half a century, every sheriff who served Mercer County eventually reached exactly the same conclusion on his own. In this new story, for more than 70 years, Miller Farm stretched across nearly 400 acres of gently rolling farmland outside the small town of Hanover, Kansas. Families living nearby measured the passing seasons by the color of its wheat fields. During spring, the hills glowed bright green beneath endless skies. By midsummer, golden grain swayed almost silently in the warm prairie wind before combines harvested the fields well into autumn. The farmhouse itself, built in 1947 by returning World War II veteran Samuel Miller, overlooked the property from a modest rise near the northern fence line. Nothing about the place suggested mystery. 3 generations of the Miller family raised crops, cattle, and children there without attracting more attention than any other hardworking farm in the county. Yet, in 2021, during preparations for a new irrigation system, construction crews uncovered something buried beneath one of the oldest fields. Whatever they found transformed Miller Farm from an ordinary agricultural property into the center of one of Kansas's most unsettling, unsolved investigations. The discovery began with a routine excavation. After years of unpredictable drought, Daniel Miller decided to modernize the farm by installing underground irrigation pipes across the western acreage. Engineers surveyed the property, marked utility lines, and approved trenching equipment to begin digging shortly after sunrise one Monday morning in March. Work progressed normally for several hours before an excavator operator felt the bucket strike something unusually solid nearly 8 feet below the surface. Expecting exposed limestone common throughout the region, workers climbed into the trench carrying shovels to clear loose soil. Instead of bedrock, they uncovered a perfectly flat concrete surface extending well beyond the width of the excavation. The slab appeared surprisingly smooth despite decades beneath the earth. No county records mentioned buried structures anywhere on the property. Curious but unconcerned, the crew contacted Daniel, assuming they had discovered forgotten farm foundations left by previous owners. Historical maps quickly complicated that explanation. County archives showed no buildings had ever occupied the western field before Samuel Miller purchased the land after the war. Earlier, aerial photographs dating back to the 1930s displayed uninterrupted cropland stretching in every direction. There were no barns, wells, grain silos, storm shelters, or military installations. Yet further excavation revealed the concrete slab continued beneath nearly 2 acres of farmland. Surveyors estimated its thickness at more than 3 feet, suggesting an enormous amount of material had been poured underground for reasons no document explained. Engineers expressed surprise that such a massive structure had remained undiscovered for generations despite decades of farming directly above it. Daniel halted construction until county officials inspected the site. Initial assumptions centered on forgotten infrastructure from Cold War civil defense projects. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, various underground facilities had quietly appeared across rural America. Perhaps Miller Farm unknowingly covered an abandoned government installation, later erased from public memory. State engineers requested permission to expose one corner of the slab more thoroughly before drawing conclusions. Over the next 2 days, heavy machinery removed nearly 5,000 cubic yards of soil. The excavation eventually revealed something no one expected. Embedded within the concrete lay a pair of massive steel doors positioned side by side, each nearly 12 feet tall and heavily reinforced from the inside. Despite decades underground, the hinges showed remarkably little corrosion. No handles appeared on the exterior. Whoever designed the doors had intended them to remain inaccessible from above. Sheriff Thomas Green secured the area immediately. While no law prohibited opening abandoned underground structures, officials worried about hazardous materials, unstable air quality, or unexploded military equipment. Specialists from the State Emergency Management Office arrived carrying atmospheric testing instruments before attempting entry. Air samples extracted through a narrow inspection hole revealed breathable oxygen, no dangerous gases, and surprisingly low humidity. One engineer remarked that conditions resembled a sealed basement rather than an abandoned underground chamber buried for half a century. After documenting every visible detail, workers attached hydraulic lifting equipment to specially welded brackets. The steel doors resisted briefly before slowly separating with a deep metallic groan unheard by anyone for decades. Below them descended a broad concrete staircase disappearing into darkness. Electricians lowered portable floodlights through the opening. The staircase extended nearly 40 feet before reaching another landing. No flooding appeared. No collapsed ceilings. No obvious structural damage. Everything looked almost impossibly intact. The first inspection team entered cautiously that afternoon, wearing protective equipment despite air tests indicating no immediate danger. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves inside a long central corridor branching into dozens of rooms arranged with remarkable precision. Concrete walls remained smooth and dry. Electrical conduit lined the ceilings, though no power remained connected. Metal doors numbered in faded black paint extended down both sides of the hallway. Dust covered every surface, yet remarkably few cobwebs appeared anywhere underground. It looked less like a forgotten bunker than a building someone had quietly locked before walking away forever. The earliest rooms contained exactly what investigators expected: storage shelves, rusted filing cabinets, water tanks, mechanical equipment. Most had been emptied long before the facility disappeared beneath the fields. Then the team reached room 14. Unlike every other room, its door remained locked, not by corrosion, by a functioning steel deadbolt. Locksmiths eventually opened the mechanism without damaging it. Inside, they discovered dozens of wooden crates stacked neatly against reinforced walls. Every crate stood empty except one. That final crate contained hundreds of black and white photographs. None carried names. None carried dates. Every photograph showed Miller Farm. The images stretched across decades. Some clearly predated Samuel Miller's ownership. Others depicted tractors purchased years after his death. One photograph showed Daniel himself repairing a fence during the previous summer. Investigators examined the image repeatedly. Daniel confirmed no stranger had been present that day. The angle suggested the photograph had been taken from somewhere beneath the hill where the underground facility now stood. There had been no opening, no visible structure, no place for anyone to hide. The discovery immediately shifted the investigation. Attention turned toward determining who had occupied the underground complex and why they possessed photographs spanning nearly 80 years of ordinary farm life. Federal archives produced no record matching the facility. Military historians ruled out missile installations. Agricultural agencies denied involvement. Even the Army Corps of Engineers confirmed they had never constructed anything comparable beneath private farmland in Kansas. Property deeds revealed no interruptions in Miller family ownership. Legally, the underground structure had never existed. Further exploration uncovered additional mysteries. Room 22 contained wall calendars ending abruptly in October 1968. Coffee cups still rested upon desks. Clipboards remained hanging beside empty filing cabinets. One office contained a typewriter with a single unfinished sheet of paper still rolled into the carriage. Time and moisture had faded most of the ink beyond recognition. Only the final line remained readable. Observation continues above. Forensic teams searched the entire facility expecting signs of occupants. Fingerprints had long since degraded. DNA samples proved inconclusive. No clothing, no personal belongings, no human remains. It appeared everyone had departed in an orderly fashion while deliberately removing nearly every trace of themselves. Only the photographs remained, as though someone had considered them too important or too dangerous to destroy. News of the discovery spread quickly throughout Kansas. Speculation flourished. Secret military experiments, Cold War surveillance, government continuity shelters. None matched the available evidence. Why monitor one ordinary family farm for generations? Why bury an enormous facility beneath productive farmland without leaving a single public record? No explanation survived careful scrutiny. Several weeks later, historians reviewing Samuel Miller's personal journals uncovered a brief passage written during the autumn of 1954. Most entries discussed rainfall, livestock prices, and crop yields. One page differed. Samuel mentioned hearing heavy machinery operating somewhere beneath the western fields late at night. Assuming nearby oil exploration had begun, he investigated the following morning. Finding nothing unusual, he never mentioned the sounds again. Researchers initially dismissed the note. Then they realized the journals described the noises 14 years before the underground calendars abruptly ended. The most unsettling discovery came near the conclusion of the investigation. At the far end of the main corridor stood a small observation room overlooking nothing. A single reinforced window faced a blank concrete wall only a few feet away. Inside rested one metal desk bolted to the floor. Upon it, investigators found a leather notebook preserved inside a sealed drawer. Nearly every page had been removed. Only the inside cover remained. Written neatly in fountain pen were 8 simple words. They still think they're the first family here. No one has ever determined who wrote the sentence. No earlier ownership records identify another family living on the property before the Millers beyond routine 19th century homesteaders. Archaeological surveys uncovered no evidence of forgotten settlements beneath the farm. The remark remains entirely without context. Yet it permanently changed how investigators viewed everything else inside the facility. After nearly 2 years of study, officials permanently sealed the underground structure, citing safety concerns related to long-term structural stability. The steel doors were welded shut before thousands of tons of soil returned to the excavation, restoring the wheat field almost exactly as it had appeared before construction began. Daniel Miller eventually completed the irrigation project several hundred yards away, choosing never to disturb the western acreage again. Today, the field grows wheat every summer, just as it has for generations. Passing motorists see nothing unusual beyond endless rows of grain stretching toward the horizon. Beneath them, according to every official report, lies an empty underground facility whose purpose remains unknown. The photographs recovered there now rest inside a climate-controlled evidence archive, where investigators occasionally study them, hoping to identify whoever spent decades quietly watching one ordinary American farm. They have never succeeded. The only certainty left behind is that someone was there long before anyone discovered the doors, and for reasons no record has ever explained, they had been watching the Miller family almost from the day they first arrived. In this new story, the Harrison family believed they had finally reached the quiet chapter of life they had spent decades chasing. After 40 years of work, raising children, paying bills, and living among endless traffic and crowded neighborhoods outside Columbus, Ohio, retirement promised something entirely different. They imagined mornings filled with birdsong instead of highway noise, evenings illuminated by stars rather than shopping centers, and weekends measured by changing seasons instead of calendars. Their search for that simpler life eventually ended at the very last property on Willow Road, a forgotten county lane that disappeared into dense hardwood forests before ending at a weathered farmhouse standing completely alone against the Ohio countryside. The house carried more than a century of history within its faded white walls, but to Mark and Ellen Harrison, it looked less like an abandoned relic and more like the peaceful future they had always imagined. Willow Road had never been an important road. It connected no major highways, passed through no towns, and offered little reason for strangers to travel beyond its first mile. 4 occupied homes remained scattered along its winding path, each separated by hundreds of yards of woodland, neglected pasture, and fields that had slowly returned to nature after generations of farming families disappeared. Telephone poles leaned slightly with age, old split-rail fences vanished beneath vines and wild blackberry bushes. Every autumn, thick blankets of maple leaves covered the pavement until passing trucks crushed them into dark ribbons stretching toward the forest. By the time the Harrisons arrived during the final week of September, most trees had already begun changing from deep green to brilliant shades of gold, orange, and crimson, transforming the landscape into something that resembled an old American painting rather than modern life. The farmhouse itself had been built in 1912 by Samuel Whitmore, whose family remained on the property for more than 100 years. County archives described him as a respected dairy farmer, church deacon, and volunteer firefighter whose descendants gradually abandoned farming as economic conditions changed throughout the 20th century. By the early 1990s, only Margaret Whitmore still occupied the property. She lived quietly and almost entirely alone until her death at 92. Her obituary described a woman devoted to gardening, preserving family photographs, and maintaining the old farmhouse exactly as her parents had left it decades earlier. No mention appeared of unusual events, local legends, or mysterious history. The estate passed through probate without dispute before eventually appearing on the real estate market with an asking price far below similar properties nearby. Friends congratulated the Harrisons on discovering what seemed like the bargain of a lifetime. Mark approached the move with practical confidence. Years spent repairing heavy diesel locomotives had taught him that every problem eventually revealed a logical explanation. Old buildings creaked because wood expanded and contracted. Pipes rattled because water pressure changed. Electrical systems failed because wires aged. Superstition had never interested him. Ellen possessed a gentler perspective. She believed every old home preserved traces of the people who had once filled its rooms. Looking through dusty windows during their first visit, she imagined holiday dinners, children racing upstairs, birthdays celebrated around the worn oak dining table, and countless ordinary moments quietly absorbed into the walls over generations. Neither interpretation conflicted with the other. Together, they simply saw an aging farmhouse waiting for another family to continue its story. Their first month unfolded exactly as retirement should have. Mornings began with coffee on the broad front porch, while fog drifted slowly across nearby fields before dissolving beneath rising sunlight. Mark repaired loose fencing surrounding the abandoned pasture and restored neglected tools left inside the machine shed. Ellen transformed overgrown flower beds into orderly gardens, bursting with chrysanthemums and late-blooming asters. Their golden retriever, Bailey, explored every corner of the property before returning home each afternoon, carrying leaves tangled throughout his thick fur. Evenings settled peacefully over Willow Road. Without nearby cities, commercial buildings, or heavy traffic, darkness arrived completely. Stars appeared brighter than either of them remembered seeing in decades. Silence became a comforting companion rather than an uncomfortable absence. Like many historic farmhouses throughout the Midwest, the house constantly reminded its owners of its age. Heavy oak beams cracked softly after sudden drops in temperature. Loose nails shifted beneath old floorboards, producing sounds that occasionally resembled distant footsteps. Wind passing beneath the roof created long, low vibrations capable of rattling upstairs windows. Modern engineers have documented such behavior in countless wooden buildings constructed before contemporary materials became common. Mark accepted every unfamiliar sound as another reminder that houses, much like people, change naturally with age. Nothing seemed especially unusual until the evening. Every light inside the farmhouse illuminated simultaneously. At exactly 11:14 on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday night, every light throughout the property switched on without warning. The kitchen, living room, upstairs hallway, attic, basement, pantry, garage, and even the single porch light facing the gravel driveway all glowed with identical brightness. 7 seconds later, every bulb went dark together before instantly returning. The sequence repeated 4 more times before stopping completely. The event lasted less than 1 minute. By midnight, the electrical system functioned perfectly normally. The following morning, Mark inspected every breaker, outlet, switch, and visible section of wiring. Nothing appeared damaged. The Regional Electric Cooperative confirmed no outages, maintenance work, or voltage irregularities had occurred anywhere along Willow Road that evening. With no practical explanation available, the incident quietly joined the growing collection of strange experiences people occasionally encountered in old houses before eventually forgetting them. The lights returned 6 nights later, then again 3 nights after that. Eventually, Mark noticed they always appeared within minutes of 11 o'clock. The timing remained astonishingly consistent regardless of weather conditions or electrical usage inside the farmhouse. One evening, he stepped outside while the lights flashed repeatedly behind him. From the front yard, he noticed something impossible to explain. Every window glowed brightly except one. The eastern guest bedroom remained completely black, despite the ceiling fixture inside having clearly illuminated moments earlier. The window reflected no surrounding light whatsoever. Instead, it resembled an empty opening cut directly into the side of the house. Curious, Mark immediately climbed the stairs after the lights stopped flashing. Inside the guest bedroom, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. The light switch worked normally, the bulb glowed brightly, nothing seemed different. Yet, standing alone in the center of the room, he experienced the unmistakable sensation that someone had occupied the space only seconds before his arrival. Bailey changed shortly afterward. The friendly retriever, who had eagerly followed his owners from room to room, suddenly refused to climb the staircase after sunset. Instead, he positioned himself beside the front entrance every evening, staring silently toward the upstairs hallway. Veterinarians often explain such behavior through heightened canine hearing. Dogs detect frequencies humans cannot perceive and frequently respond to wildlife hidden inside walls or attics. Mark accepted that explanation without hesitation until Bailey stopped entering the house altogether. One afternoon, the dog disappeared while exploring the surrounding fields. Mark searched neighboring woods until well after dark. Heavy rain soaked the countryside throughout the night. At sunrise, Bailey was found lying quietly on the front porch, exactly where he usually waited each morning. His fur remained completely dry. His paws carried no traces of mud, despite saturated ground covering every inch of the property. From that day forward, he refused to cross the front doorway under any circumstance, choosing instead to sleep beneath the porch while watching the upstairs windows every evening until dawn. Concerned that hidden wildlife might be disturbing the dog, Mark inspected the attic from one end to the other. Dust covered nearly every exposed beam, broken crate, and abandoned trunk. No animal tracks appeared anywhere beneath the insulation. While examining the farthest corner beneath the western roofline, he noticed a narrow wooden door concealed behind several loose boards. The door stood barely 4 feet high and lacked both a handle and visible hinges on the outside. Curious, he pushed gently against the weathered wood. It swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a cramped storage space no larger than a bedroom closet. Inside rested only a small cedar chest covered by decades of dust. The brass latch resisted briefly before finally opening with a sharp metallic click that echoed throughout the silent attic. The chest contained dozens of neatly bundled letters, faded family photographs, several church bulletins dating back to the 1930s, and 3 leather-bound journals belonging to different generations of the Whitmore family. Most entries described ordinary farm life harvests, births, funerals, livestock, weather, and church gatherings, yet beginning in the winter of 1938, the tone changed dramatically. Without ever mentioning ghosts, spirits, or supernatural forces, each writer described an identical feeling that returned every autumn after the first frost. The farmhouse seemed increasingly difficult to leave after sunset. Short trips into town became exhausting. Family members repeatedly postponed vacations without understanding why. Invitations from relatives were declined almost automatically. No one claimed invisible forces prevented them from leaving. Instead, they described an overwhelming certainty that everything important remained inside the farmhouse and could not safely be abandoned until tomorrow. Every tomorrow quietly became another week, another month, another year. Mark dismissed the journals as little more than evidence of loneliness, gradually affecting several generations who had spent their entire lives in isolation. Psychological studies have long documented the powerful influence of familiar environments upon aging individuals. People often develop deep emotional attachments to homes filled with lifelong memories. The Whitmores had simply struggled to leave the only place they had ever known. The explanation satisfied him until he reached the final journal belonging to Margaret Whitmore. Her final completed entry had been written only 12 days before her death. The handwriting remained steady, but one sentence appeared underlined 3 separate times. It read, "The house never locks the doors to keep anyone out. It leaves them unlocked because it knows no one who enters ever truly wants to leave." That evening, Mark intended to drive into Ashford and donate the journals to the local historical society. He carried the cedar chest downstairs, placed it beside the front door, collected his truck keys, and stepped onto the porch. The truck sat exactly where he had parked it only hours earlier. The gravel driveway stretched toward Willow Road beneath the fading light of sunset. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Yet, instead of walking toward the driver's door, Mark found himself stopping halfway across the porch. An unexpected thought settled quietly into his mind. The trip could easily wait until morning. The journals would be perfectly safe inside the house overnight. There seemed no urgent reason to leave after dark. He returned the keys to the kitchen counter without consciously deciding to do so. Ellen later did exactly the same with a planned visit to town. Neither discussed the change because it felt perfectly reasonable. Outside, Bailey remained beneath the porch, watching the upstairs guest room window. As darkness settled over Willow Road, every light inside the farmhouse switched on at precisely 11:14. This time, neither Mark nor Ellen noticed. They remained comfortably seated beside the fireplace, quietly convinced there was nowhere else they needed to be. In this new story, for nearly 40 years, the McAllister home stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood outside Franklin, Vermont, overlooking a stretch of maple woods that turned brilliant shades of orange every autumn. Built in 1972 by a local contractor, the 2-story colonial house resembled dozens of others scattered throughout the county. Children rode bicycles along the narrow street every afternoon. Neighbors mowed their lawns on weekends. Families gathered for summer barbecues while the distant church bell marked each passing hour. Nothing about the property invited curiosity. It carried no reputation for tragedy, no whispered stories about strange lights or unexplained disappearances. Yet, after the winter of 2016, the house became known throughout the county for one impossible question. Why would an ordinary man voluntarily lock himself inside his own basement and never come back out? David McAllister had retired only 8 months earlier after spending 34 years repairing commercial heating systems across northern New England. His coworkers described him as practical to the point of stubbornness. If a furnace stopped working, David believed the answer always existed somewhere inside the machinery. Broken things could be understood, provided someone remained patient enough to examine every detail. That attitude shaped nearly every part of his life. His garage remained meticulously organized. Tools hung in perfectly straight rows above an immaculate workbench. Every receipt, warranty card, and instruction manual occupied labeled folders inside a metal filing cabinet. Nothing in David's personality suggested irrational behavior. He disliked mysteries because they implied someone had failed to gather enough information. His wife, Elaine, often joked that retirement worried David more than any mechanical failure ever could. After decades following structured schedules, he suddenly found himself with entire days free from responsibility. Friends encouraged him to travel, fish, or take up woodworking. Instead, David focused almost entirely on home improvement projects. He repaired aging windows, replaced sections of the roof, repainted bedrooms, and reorganized storage areas that had remained untouched for years. The largest project involved the unfinished basement beneath the house. Built almost entirely from poured concrete, it contained the furnace, water heater, electrical panel, and shelves crowded with decades of carefully labeled boxes. David planned to transform the space into a workshop where he could spend long winter afternoons restoring antique tools. Work progressed steadily through late autumn. Neighbors frequently saw David carrying lumber downstairs, while delivery trucks unloaded insulation, drywall, lighting fixtures, and new electrical outlets. Everything appeared ordinary until early December, when his routine quietly changed. Rather than inviting neighbors inside to admire his progress, David began avoiding conversations altogether. Deliveries were left on the front porch instead of being signed for personally. Evening lights remained on in the basement long after midnight. Elaine assumed her husband had simply become absorbed in another ambitious project. Retirement often encouraged harmless obsessions. She thought little of it until David started replacing every lock connecting the basement to the rest of the house. The first new lock appeared on the basement door leading from the kitchen. A heavy-duty deadbolt replaced the simple latch originally installed when the house was built. Days later, another lock secured the exterior bulkhead entrance opening into the backyard. Finally, David installed thick steel slide bolts along the inside of the basement stairwell door. When Elaine asked why such precautions seemed necessary, David answered calmly that certain doors should remain closed once they were properly secured. The explanation sounded strangely unlike him. Normally, he discussed every project in exhausting detail. This time, he refused further conversation, insisting only that the changes were temporary until he finished organizing the workshop. Christmas approached with unusually heavy snowfall, blanketing Franklin beneath nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. Family gatherings continued as planned, though relatives later remembered David appearing distracted throughout the holiday meal. He smiled politely, participated in conversations, and exchanged gifts with grandchildren exactly as expected. Yet several times during the afternoon, he quietly excused himself to check the basement door. Each visit lasted only seconds before he returned upstairs looking noticeably relieved. No one questioned the habit. Many homeowners worried about frozen pipes during severe winters. David's behavior seemed unusual, but hardly alarming. Everything changed 3 days after New Year's Day. Elaine awoke shortly before 7 to discover David already dressed, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a handwritten envelope resting beside his coffee cup. Before she could ask what he was doing, he stood, kissed her gently on the forehead, and handed her the envelope. According to Elaine's later statement, David calmly explained that he needed to spend some time in the basement and asked her not to unlock the door, regardless of what she might hear. He insisted no one should call the police immediately because everything would eventually make sense. Before Elaine could respond, David carried a toolbox downstairs, closed the basement door behind him, and locked every bolt from the inside. At first, Elaine assumed her husband simply wanted uninterrupted time to complete another renovation project. She opened the envelope, expecting instructions about plumbing or electrical repairs. Instead, she found only a single handwritten sentence. "If I ask to come back upstairs, don't believe me." Confused, Elaine approached the basement door and called David's name. He answered immediately. His voice sounded perfectly normal. He apologized for frightening her and repeated that she must not open the door until he knocked exactly 3 times, followed by one long pause. Any other pattern, he warned, should be ignored. Before Elaine could ask another question, footsteps retreated deeper into the basement. Silence followed. The first several hours passed uneventfully. Occasional sounds drifted upward through the floor, hammering, boxes being moved, the hum of power tools. Everything resembled ordinary workshop activity. Around lunchtime, the noises stopped completely. At approximately 2:30 that afternoon, Elaine heard 3 rapid knocks against the basement door. She immediately reached for the handle. Then she remembered David's note. The pattern was wrong. There had been no long pause afterward. Only 3 quick knocks. Nothing else. Several minutes later, someone began knocking again. This time, the pattern changed. 2 knocks. Silence. 5 more knocks. Another pause. Then, a calm voice called through the door. It sounded exactly like David. He quietly apologized, claiming he had forgotten the correct signal. He asked Elaine to unlock the door because he had accidentally trapped himself beneath a heavy shelf. She stepped closer. Something about the request felt wrong. David had installed those shelves himself. They were bolted directly into concrete walls. They could not simply fall over. Elaine refused. The voice remained silent for nearly an hour. Then the scratching began. Slow, steady, almost as though someone dragged heavy furniture across the concrete floor beneath the kitchen. The sound continued until well after sunset. Concern eventually overcame caution. Elaine called their son Michael, who arrived with 2 neighboring residents shortly before 9 that evening. Together, they stood outside the basement door, discussing whether David might genuinely require medical assistance. As they debated, everyone heard footsteps climbing the wooden stairs from below. The footsteps stopped directly behind the locked door. David's voice calmly greeted each person by name. He laughed softly before asking why they refused to let him out. Michael immediately reached toward the deadbolt. Elaine grabbed his arm. She reminded him of the note. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then, David's voice quietly said something that froze everyone standing in the kitchen. He thanked Elaine for remembering. The footsteps slowly descended back into the basement. Police arrived less than 20 minutes later. Officers repeatedly ordered David to unlock the door. No response came. Concerned about a possible medical emergency, they forced the door open shortly after 10. The basement lights remained on. Every tool rested neatly in its proper place. Fresh sawdust covered the workbench. David's toolbox sat open beside an unfinished wooden cabinet. The room was completely empty. Investigators immediately searched every corner of the basement. Concrete walls showed no hidden passages. Small basement windows remained locked from inside. The exterior bulkhead door still contained every lock David had installed, all secured exactly as before. There was only one entrance, the one police had just forced open. According to everyone present, David McAllister could not have left without passing directly through the officers waiting upstairs. The investigation continued for nearly 18 months. Structural engineers confirmed no concealed spaces existed beneath the foundation. Ground-penetrating radar revealed solid earth surrounding every basement wall. Search dogs tracked David's scent only as far as the center of the basement, before stopping completely. Forensic testing uncovered fingerprints, boot prints, and DNA belonging exclusively to David and immediate family members. No signs of violence appeared anywhere inside the house. Financial records showed no preparations for voluntary disappearance. His passport, wallet, medications, and winter coat remained upstairs exactly where he had left them that morning. Months later, while reviewing recordings from a home security camera facing the backyard, investigators noticed something peculiar. Throughout the entire day, no one entered or exited the property. Yet, at exactly 2:31 p.m., the precise moment Elaine first heard, the 3 knocks the basement lights briefly flickered, despite no interruption in electrical service affecting the neighborhood. Electrical engineers dismissed the event as insignificant. Elaine never agreed. She remained convinced the flicker occurred at the exact moment something inside the basement realized the door would remain locked. The McAllister house stood vacant for nearly 6 years before eventually being purchased by an investment company. Renovation crews removed the old workshop, replaced damaged flooring, and modernized every room. During demolition, workers discovered nothing unusual hidden beneath the concrete slab or behind basement walls. Yet every contractor involved independently reported the same odd habit developing while working below ground. Without discussing it beforehand, each man admitted feeling an inexplicable urge to lock the basement door before beginning work, followed by an equally powerful reluctance to unlock it again until someone else arrived upstairs. None could explain the feeling. None claimed to see anything unusual. They simply described a quiet certainty that whatever remained safest on one side of the door should probably stay there. Today, David McAllister's disappearance remains officially unsolved. Law enforcement continues listing him as a missing person, despite exhaustive searches yielding no trace of his whereabouts. The handwritten note recovered from Elaine's kitchen table remains preserved inside the county evidence archive. Investigators have analyzed every word countless times, hoping some overlooked detail might explain why an intelligent, practical man deliberately imprisoned himself inside a room with no apparent escape. They never found one. The only certainty left behind was the one David himself seemed desperate to communicate before turning the key. He wasn't afraid of being locked inside the basement. He was afraid of whatever might eventually ask to be let back out. In this new story, for nearly 60 years, the Whitlock house stood quietly at the end of Briar Lane, a narrow road outside the small town of Ashford, Pennsylvania. Built in 1958, the modest two-story home overlooked gently rolling farmland bordered by old maple trees and weathered stone fences that had survived generations of changing owners. Neighbors described it as one of the most peaceful properties in the county. Nothing dramatic had ever happened there, no violent crimes had been recorded, no fires had damaged the structure, no mysterious deaths appeared in public records. It was simply another well-kept American home occupied for decades by the same elderly couple who seemed perfectly content growing old together. Yet, by the winter of 2020, the Whitlock residence became the center of one of Pennsylvania's strangest unsolved investigations after Harold and June Whitlock disappeared without leaving their dinner table. Harold Whitlock retired after 38 years as a high school history teacher. Quiet, dependable, and deeply organized, he followed almost the same routine every day of his adult life. June had spent most of her years working as the town librarian before retiring shortly after her husband. Together, they became familiar faces throughout Ashford. Every Saturday, they attended the farmers market. Every Sunday, they occupied the third pew at First Community Church. Every Wednesday afternoon, they visited the local diner, where the waitress rarely needed to ask what they planned to order. Friends often joked that the Whitlocks were so predictable, people could practically set their watches by them. Their routines never varied enough to concern anyone, until one Tuesday evening when they simply stopped existing within everyone else's expectations. The day itself appeared completely ordinary. Security footage from a nearby grocery store showed Harold purchasing fresh bread, soup ingredients, and a bottle of red wine shortly after 4 o'clock that afternoon. Cash register receipts confirmed the transaction. Several customers later remembered briefly speaking with him near the produce section. Nothing about his behavior suggested anxiety, illness, or distraction. He smiled politely, loaded his groceries into the trunk of his aging Buick, and drove home exactly as he had done hundreds of times before. June spent the afternoon tending to houseplants while speaking with her younger sister over the telephone. The call lasted nearly 40 minutes and ended with plans to meet for lunch later that week. Neither conversation contained anything unusual. Both sounded relaxed, cheerful, and entirely ordinary. At approximately 6:15 that evening, neighbors noticed lights illuminating the dining room overlooking the backyard. Through partially open curtains, they occasionally caught brief glimpses of Harold and June setting the table as darkness settled across Briar Lane. Such observations meant little because the couple always ate dinner around the same time. Shortly after 7, another neighbor walking his Labrador passed the house and noticed both figures seated across from one another beneath the hanging dining room light. The television remained off, just as it usually did during meals. Steam appeared to rise gently from bowls placed neatly before them. Nothing seemed unusual enough to deserve another thought. It became the final confirmed sighting of Harold and June Whitlock. The following morning, their mailbox remained full. Newspapers accumulated untouched near the front porch throughout Wednesday and Thursday. By Friday afternoon, June failed to appear for her weekly volunteer shift at the public library without calling ahead for the first time in nearly 20 years. Concerned, the library director contacted Harold's sister, who immediately drove to Briar Lane, accompanied by a county deputy. Both vehicles remained parked outside, while repeated knocks echoed through the quiet house. No one answered. Curtains remained exactly as they had earlier in the week. Harold's Buick still occupied the driveway. Finding every door locked from inside, except the kitchen entrance, which stood strangely unlatched, the deputy entered to perform a welfare check. Nothing inside suggested panic or violence. The living room remained perfectly organized. Family photographs stood neatly arranged across polished shelves. Beds upstairs had been made that morning according to their usual routine. The bathroom sink remained dry. Every window was locked from inside. No signs of forced entry appeared anywhere around the property. The kitchen looked recently cleaned, with only a damp dish towel hanging beside the sink. Then the deputy entered the dining room and immediately stopped. The table remained set for two, exactly as neighbors had seen several evenings earlier. 2 bowls of homemade vegetable soup rested untouched before each chair. Fresh bread remained sliced inside a basket between them. 2 wine glasses stood half full. Cloth napkins still rested across both laps, as though the couple had simply paused their meal for a moment before intending to continue. Yet Harold and June had vanished completely. Investigators initially considered ordinary explanations. Perhaps the couple had suffered a medical emergency outside after hearing an unusual noise. Search teams thoroughly examined the surrounding property, nearby woods, drainage ditches, abandoned barns, and neighboring fields without discovering footprints, discarded clothing, or evidence anyone had left the house voluntarily. Blood detection tests revealed nothing unusual. Fingerprints throughout the dining room belonged only to Harold and June. Every personal possession remained inside the house, including wallets, purses, identification cards, eyeglasses, prescription medications, mobile phones, and car keys. Even Harold's hearing aids rested neatly beside his plate, suggesting he had removed them shortly before beginning dinner. Investigators found it difficult to explain why anyone preparing for an evening meal would suddenly abandon everything essential to daily life without taking a single personal item. The untouched meal quickly became one of the investigation's most puzzling details. Forensic specialists estimated the soup had cooled naturally without interruption shortly after being served. Laboratory testing found no poison, sedatives, or unusual substances within either bowl. Wine samples proved identical to the unopened bottle discovered on the kitchen counter. Fresh fingerprints covered serving utensils exactly as expected during ordinary meal preparation. Chairs remained pushed slightly backward at comfortable dining angles, not overturned or hurriedly abandoned. One detail, however, quietly unsettled experienced investigators. Neither bowl showed evidence that either Harold or June had taken even a single spoonful. Everything suggested they had sat down, prepared to begin eating, and then somehow disappeared before the first bite. County detectives spent months reconstructing every minute leading to that Tuesday evening. Bank records showed no unusual financial activity. Security cameras confirmed no unknown vehicles approached the property during relevant hours. Telephone records ended shortly after June's afternoon conversation with her sister. Internet usage ceased around 5:30 following Harold's routine weather forecast. Utility companies documented uninterrupted electrical service. Smart meter data even indicated ordinary household activity until approximately 6:48, when electricity usage unexpectedly dropped despite lights remaining switched on throughout the house. Electrical engineers later concluded the fluctuation represented nothing more than several appliances completing normal operating cycles. Still, the precise timing fascinated investigators because it roughly matched the estimated moment Harold and June vanished. Searching for historical clues, Detective Samuel Ortiz reviewed decades of property records, expecting to uncover forgotten incidents connected to the house itself. Instead, he discovered a curious pattern involving previous owners. Before the Whitlocks purchased the property in 1978, an elderly widow named Eleanor Graves had lived there alone for nearly 15 years. According to handwritten notes preserved inside probate documents, Eleanor frequently insisted that dinner should never be delayed after the table had been completely prepared. Friends dismissed the habit as harmless eccentricity. Yet, among her personal papers, investigators discovered a folded journal page containing only a few sentences. The final line had been written several times in increasingly uneven handwriting. It simply read, "If the chairs are occupied before the meal begins, never leave the table unfinished." No explanation followed. Eleanor herself had died peacefully from natural causes years earlier, leaving no indication she considered the statement anything more than a private superstition. Ortiz dismissed the journal until another discovery emerged weeks later. A retired carpenter contacted investigators after recognizing photographs of the Whitlock dining room shown during a local television broadcast. He explained that he had helped renovate the house shortly after its construction in the late 1950s. While replacing damaged floorboards beneath the dining room decades earlier, he remembered finding a narrow metal box hidden between the joists. Believing it contained old building permits, the workers opened it before handing everything to the homeowner. Inside rested only a faded, handwritten note. Curious, the carpenter read it before returning the contents. Although most of the message had faded from memory, one sentence remained unforgettable because everyone on the crew laughed at how strangely specific it sounded. The note warned future owners never to leave the dining table once every place had been set, because someone unseen would eventually expect the meal to begin. At the time, the warning sounded ridiculous. None of the workers ever mentioned it again. Despite years of investigation, no evidence ever established what truly happened inside the Whitlock house that Tuesday evening. Search warrants, forensic testing, psychological profiles, financial audits, and countless interviews all ended with the same impossible conclusion. Harold and June Whitlock had simply ceased to be present inside a home that continued preserving every ordinary detail of their final evening together. The soup slowly spoiled before investigators removed it. The wine eventually evaporated from the glasses. Dust gradually settled across untouched plates, displayed later inside the county evidence archive. The house itself remained empty for nearly 4 years because no buyer wished to purchase a property associated with such an unsettling mystery. Eventually, the county acquired it through legal proceedings before quietly converting the land into part of a public conservation project. The building was demolished after engineers declared it structurally unsafe. Workers later admitted the dining room proved strangely difficult to dismantle because every evening, just before leaving the site, they somehow found 2 folding chairs standing neatly where the old dinner table had once been. No one ever claimed to see who placed them there. Even today, retired detectives occasionally revisit the Whitlock case, searching for overlooked evidence. They always reach the same frustrating conclusion. Plenty of mysteries begin with someone leaving home unexpectedly. Almost none begin with 2 people who never managed to leave their own dinner table at all. In this new story, for nearly 50 years, the Walker House stood alone on a gentle hill overlooking the countryside outside Millfield, Indiana. It was not particularly large, nor was it especially beautiful. The white paint faded quickly beneath harsh winters, the porch sagged slightly toward one corner, and the surrounding fields had long since stopped producing enough crops to support a working farm. Yet, despite its ordinary appearance, local residents knew the property better than almost any other house in the county. Visitors occasionally slowed their vehicles when passing the gravel driveway. Real estate agents pointed toward it whenever discussing unusual listings. Even teenagers told stories about it during late-night drives through the area. The reason was simple. After 1984, the house was never sold again. At first glance, the situation made little sense. Houses changed ownership constantly, families moved, elderly residents passed away. Properties were inherited, renovated, demolished, and rebuilt. Such transitions formed a normal part of life in every community. Yet the Walker House somehow remained trapped outside that process. Every attempt to sell it failed. Every owner who inherited it kept it longer than intended. Every buyer who expressed serious interest eventually withdrew without providing a satisfactory explanation. Decades passed while the property remained in legal limbo, changing hands only through inheritance but never through an actual sale. By 2022, the phenomenon had become so well known that local newspapers occasionally referenced it whenever discussing unusual county history. The story began with Robert and Helen Walker. Married shortly after World War II, they purchased the property in 1948 while raising 3 children. Robert worked as a mechanic in a nearby manufacturing plant, while Helen managed the household and maintained a sprawling vegetable garden behind the house. Together, they built a stable life that appeared remarkably ordinary. Neighbors remembered summer cookouts, church gatherings, and holiday celebrations that regularly filled the home with family members. Nothing about the Walkers suggested mystery or tragedy. If anything, they represented the kind of dependable American family often remembered fondly by entire communities. When Robert died unexpectedly from a heart attack in 1984, Helen found herself unable to maintain the property alone. Her children lived in different states, and medical problems made caring for the house increasingly difficult. Selling seemed like the obvious solution. The property was listed through a respected local agency and attracted immediate interest. Several buyers toured the house within the first month. One family even submitted a formal offer slightly above the asking price. Everything appeared ready to proceed normally until the buyers unexpectedly withdrew the day before signing final paperwork. Their explanation seemed vague. They simply stated that they no longer felt comfortable purchasing the property. The agent assumed they had found another house and moved on. Then it happened again. Another buyer toured the house, expressed enthusiasm, and initiated financing paperwork. 2 weeks later, they canceled the transaction without explanation. A third prospective buyer abandoned negotiations after scheduling a final inspection. A fourth family refused to return phone calls entirely after spending nearly 3 hours exploring the property. None reported structural problems, none raised concerns regarding the location, mortgage approvals remained intact, yet every sale collapsed shortly before completion. By the end of the year, Helen had become deeply frustrated. The house remained on the market despite attracting consistent interest. Something seemed to happen between initial enthusiasm and final commitment, but no one could adequately describe what it was. The pattern continued through the following decade. After Helen moved into assisted living, ownership passed to her oldest son, Michael. Living nearly 600 miles away, he viewed the property as a financial burden rather than a family treasure. Confident that fresh marketing would solve previous difficulties, he hired a different agency and reduced the asking price substantially. Interest returned immediately. The same outcome followed. Potential buyers toured the property, imagined living there, discussed renovation plans, and then disappeared from the process. Some stopped responding entirely, others offered strangely similar explanations. They all described leaving the property with a powerful feeling that buying the house would somehow be a mistake, despite being unable to identify any specific reason. Local rumors naturally began developing. Some residents blamed hidden structural defects, others speculated about contaminated groundwater or undisclosed legal complications. A few embraced more dramatic explanations involving ghosts or curses, yet inspections consistently disproved such theories. Engineers found no serious structural concerns. Environmental testing revealed nothing unusual. Property records remained remarkably clean, tax payments were current, ownership history contained no criminal investigations, violent incidents, or unexplained deaths beyond Robert Walker's natural passing decades earlier. Every practical explanation slowly collapsed beneath scrutiny. The mystery might have remained little more than local folklore, if not for an event that occurred in 1998. That year, a retired accountant named Charles Brenner came closer than anyone else to purchasing the property. Unlike previous buyers, Charles remained determined despite hearing rumors surrounding the house. He completed inspections, secured financing, and signed every required document. The closing appointment was scheduled for the following Friday morning. According to everyone involved, the sale was essentially finished. On Thursday evening, Charles returned alone for one final visit before taking possession. He wanted measurements for furniture placement and planned to spend less than an hour inside. Shortly after sunset, he unlocked the front door and entered, carrying a flashlight and notebook. He remained inside for approximately 40 minutes. When he emerged, neighbors later described him as pale and visibly shaken. The following morning, he canceled the purchase and refused to discuss the matter publicly. Friends repeatedly asked what happened during his final visit. Charles offered only one response. He claimed the house had convinced him not to buy it. The explanation sounded absurd. Houses could not convince anyone of anything, yet Charles never elaborated further. He simply abandoned the purchase and spent the remainder of his life refusing to discuss the property. His reaction fueled local curiosity for years. People wanted details. None arrived. Charles died in 2011, taking whatever explanation he possessed to the grave. Several years later, Michael Walker inherited a collection of family documents after his mother's death. While sorting through old photographs, letters, and financial records, he discovered a small journal belonging to his father. Most entries documented ordinary events, car repairs, weather observations, household expenses, and family activities. One section, however, immediately attracted attention. During the summer of 1967, Robert described experiencing recurring dreams involving the house itself. In the dreams, future owners repeatedly toured the property but never completed the purchase. They always left before signing final documents. Robert initially dismissed the dreams as meaningless until he began recording increasingly detailed descriptions. According to the journal, the house never appeared threatening. Instead, it seemed determined to remain within the family indefinitely. Robert eventually stopped mentioning the dreams altogether, apparently considering them harmless curiosities. Michael found the entries unsettling but hardly conclusive. Dreams proved nothing. Nevertheless, he continued reading. Near the end of the journal, written only weeks before Robert's death, another passage appeared. Unlike earlier entries, this one contained no discussion of dreams. Instead, Robert described a growing certainty that the house somehow remembered everyone who had ever lived inside it. The final sentence stood alone on an otherwise empty page. It read, "The house doesn't stop people from buying it. It simply knows who belongs there and who doesn't." Michael never shared the journal publicly. He considered it a private family document rather than evidence of anything meaningful. Yet over time, he noticed an uncomfortable pattern. Every person who inherited the property eventually developed the same intention. They planned to sell it, they listed it, they entertained offers, then somehow years passed without completing a transaction. The house remained exactly where it had always been, waiting patiently while generations grew older around it. In 2020, after nearly 4 decades of failed sales, Michael finally decided to donate the property to the County Historical Society. The organization accepted ownership enthusiastically, hoping to preserve the structure as a small local museum. Preparations began almost immediately. Volunteers cleaned rooms, cataloged artifacts, and planned renovation projects. Yet, as opening day approached, unexpected complications emerged. Funding disappeared, contractors withdrew, permits stalled, board members resigned. Within 18 months, the project quietly collapsed. Ownership reverted to Michael through legal arrangements established before the donation. Once again, the house remained exactly where it had always been. Today, the Walker House still stands on its lonely hill outside Millfield. Weather has aged its walls, trees have grown taller around the property, New generations pass the driveway without understanding why older residents continue discussing it. Officially, there is no mystery. No law prevents the sale. No structural defect makes ownership impossible. No documented evidence supports claims of supernatural influence. Yet, county records reveal a simple fact that no one has ever successfully explained. Since 1984, dozens of buyers have approached the finish line. None have crossed it. The strangest detail emerged only recently when a local historian compared visitor logs collected over several decades. Every serious buyer who withdrew from the transaction had written nearly identical notes while touring the property. The wording varied slightly, but the message remained remarkably consistent. Each person described feeling as though they were visiting someone else's home rather than an empty house waiting for a new owner. None claimed to see anything unusual. None reported fear. They simply experienced an overwhelming certainty that the house already belonged to someone, even when standing alone inside rooms that had remained vacant for years. Whether that feeling came from psychology, coincidence, family history, or something far stranger remains unknown. What is known is that the Walker House still has no buyer, and after 40 years, nobody can explain why every attempt to sell it ends exactly the same way. In this new story, when people in the small town of Ashwood, Tennessee, talked about unsolved mysteries, they usually mentioned old disappearances, abandoned churches hidden deep in the hills, or the passenger train that derailed outside town in 1963. Rarely did anyone mention the Parker family. Their story never involved violence, strange lights, or mysterious footprints in the woods. It began with something far more ordinary, a telephone call. Yet according to every official record, that call should never have happened. The person on the other end had been dead for 14 years. William Parker spent most of his adult life repairing farm equipment throughout eastern Tennessee. Quiet and methodical, he believed every machine, no matter how complicated, eventually revealed the reason it had stopped working. His wife, Eleanor, often joked that William trusted broken engines more than people because engines never lied. Together, they raised 2 daughters inside a modest brick house overlooking Highway 81, where they remained for nearly 40 years after the children moved away. Retirement suited them well. Their days followed a comfortable routine filled with gardening, church services, antique stores, and weekly dinners with neighbors who had known them for decades. Nothing about the Parkers suggested they would someday become part of one of the county's most puzzling stories. Their oldest daughter, Rebecca, had disappeared during the summer of 2006. 28 years old at the time, she left Knoxville early one Saturday morning, intending to visit her parents before attending a friend's birthday gathering later that evening. She never arrived at either destination. Her blue Honda Accord was discovered 3 days later in the parking lot of a small state recreation area nearly 60 miles from her planned route. The keys remained inside the ignition. Her purse rested neatly on the passenger seat. Cell phone records ended at 10:42 that morning after a brief conversation with her younger sister. Extensive searches involving volunteers, tracking dogs, helicopters, and state investigators failed to uncover any trace of Rebecca herself. Months gradually became years until the investigation quietly settled into the growing collection of unresolved missing person cases that haunt nearly every rural county in America. The Parkers refused to move. William often explained that if Rebecca somehow returned after all those years, she would know exactly where to find them. Friends admired the couple's determination while privately accepting the painful likelihood that Rebecca had probably died somewhere investigators had simply failed to discover. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Missing person posters faded beneath sunlight before eventually disappearing altogether. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited boxes filled with aging reports offering no fresh leads. 14 years slowly erased public attention without lessening the family's grief. By the autumn of 2020, William and Eleanor had settled into the quiet acceptance familiar to many families living beside unanswered questions. Hope no longer resembled expectation. Instead, it existed as something gentler, a willingness to believe that certainty, whatever form it eventually took, might someday arrive. They continued preserving Rebecca's childhood bedroom almost exactly as she had left it. Family photographs remained undisturbed upon hallway shelves. Every Christmas, Eleanor still hung Rebecca's handmade stocking above the fireplace, despite knowing no gifts would ever fill it again. Such rituals no longer seemed unusual to those who knew them. They had simply become part of the Parker household. Everything changed on the evening of October 17th. At exactly 8:14 p.m., the telephone mounted beside the kitchen wall rang once before falling silent. William barely looked up from his newspaper. Telemarketing calls had become increasingly common, and many robocall systems disconnected after a single ring. 30 seconds later, the phone rang again. Eleanor answered while William continued reading. She spoke only one word, "Hello." Then she stopped speaking altogether. William glanced toward his wife, expecting frustration with another unwanted caller. Instead, he noticed something he had not seen in 14 years. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes before she slowly lowered herself into the nearest chair without taking the receiver away from her ear. Nearly 2 full minutes passed before she finally whispered another sentence. "It's you." William immediately stood and crossed the room. Eleanor silently handed him the receiver without looking away from the wall. He placed it against his ear. For several seconds, he heard nothing except the faint hiss familiar to long-distance telephone lines. Then a woman's calm voice quietly spoke. "Dad?" William later insisted that no parent could mistake the voice of a child, no matter how much time had passed. Age changes, appearances, memories fade, voices remain astonishingly familiar. The single word carried the exact tone, rhythm, and gentle Appalachian accent Rebecca had possessed throughout her life. The conversation lasted just under 3 minutes, according to telephone company records. William repeatedly asked where she was. The caller never answered directly. Instead, she apologized for making everyone wait so long. She asked about Eleanor's arthritis, despite no one outside the family knowing the condition had worsened during recent months. She mentioned the maple tree William planted the year she graduated from high school, accurately describing a lightning scar that had appeared only the previous spring. Finally, she calmly asked both parents not to spend any more years searching because, according to her own words, she had already found the place she was supposed to be. Before William could ask another question, the line went completely silent. County investigators initially approached the incident as a sophisticated prank. Telephone fraud had grown increasingly convincing, and voice imitation technology already existed in limited forms. Detectives subpoenaed call records, expecting to trace the origin within hours. Instead, they encountered something none of them had anticipated. The incoming call appeared to originate from a disconnected landline registered to the Parker family themselves, not their current telephone, their previous number. The number disconnected in 2006 after technicians replaced damaged service lines following a severe thunderstorm. Telephone company archives confirmed the line had ceased existing 14 years earlier. No billing account remained active. No switching equipment still recognized the circuit. According to every available record, the source of the call no longer existed. Engineers from the regional telecommunications provider spent weeks reviewing equipment logs, searching for routing errors capable of explaining the anomaly. Cross circuits occasionally produced strange connections, particularly within older analog infrastructure. Digital databases occasionally misidentified originating numbers following maintenance work. Every reasonable explanation eventually collapsed. Network diagnostics confirmed the call had genuinely entered the telephone system, carrying an identification code belonging to equipment permanently removed from service more than a decade earlier. Even more unsettling, archived maintenance documents showed the physical cable associated with that number had been excavated and destroyed during highway construction in 2011. News of the unexplained call quietly spread throughout Ashwood. Some believed grief had distorted William and Eleanor's memories. Others suggested someone familiar with Rebecca had deliberately manipulated obsolete telecommunications records. Neither explanation satisfied investigators. Voice stress analysts examining William's recorded statement noted no signs of deliberate deception. Friends who had known Rebecca since childhood independently listened to a brief audio recording automatically captured by the Parker family's answering machine. The quality remained poor. Only 11 words were clearly understandable. Yet every listener reached exactly the same uncomfortable conclusion. They believed they were hearing Rebecca Parker. Detective Mason Brooks reopened the missing person investigation for the first time in nearly 8 years. Modern forensic techniques offered opportunities unavailable during the original search. Old evidence boxes returned from storage. DNA samples underwent renewed testing. Search areas were expanded using updated satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar. Hundreds of interviews were conducted once again. Nothing connected to the telephone call. Nothing explained Rebecca's disappearance. Nothing explained why someone, apparently possessing intimate knowledge of the Parker family's private life, had contacted them after 14 years of complete silence. Several months later, another discovery complicated the mystery further. While reviewing Rebecca's original case file, Brooks noticed an overlooked witness statement collected only 4 days after her disappearance. An elderly gas station owner recalled serving Rebecca shortly before noon on the day she vanished. The statement attracted little attention because investigators believed the timeline impossible. According to fuel receipts recovered from Rebecca's abandoned vehicle, she should already have been nearly 50 miles away. Yet the witness remembered one unusual detail with remarkable certainty. Rebecca had asked whether the payphone outside the station still worked. When the owner replied that the telephone had been disconnected years earlier, Rebecca smiled politely before saying she only needed it to call home. The abandoned payphone remained standing outside the station until 2010, despite no longer being connected to any telephone lines. Investigators dismissed the comment as meaningless. Detective Brooks no longer felt so certain. William Parker died peacefully in 2023 without ever learning what happened to his daughter. Eleanor followed less than a year later. Their home was eventually sold after nearly half a century of family ownership. Contractors renovating the kitchen removed the old wall-mounted telephone before donating it to a local museum exhibit documenting rural communication history. Before disconnecting the instrument, one electrician performed a routine voltage check despite knowing service had already been transferred to modern wiring. The meter briefly registered an incoming ring signal. No telephone anywhere inside the house rang. The instrument itself remained completely silent. Yet for less than 2 seconds, the line behaved exactly as though someone, somewhere, had tried calling that number again. The technician repeated the test 3 separate times. The signal never returned. Today, Rebecca Parker's disappearance officially remains unsolved. Telecommunications experts continue describing the 2020 phone call as a system anomaly without identifying any mechanism capable of producing it. Investigators never found evidence of fraud, equipment failure, or criminal manipulation. The recording, preserved inside the County Evidence Archive, still ends with the same calm farewell spoken by a woman who, according to every official record, had vanished 14 years earlier. Whether the call came from someone still alive, from an impossible flaw buried deep within forgotten telephone systems, or from something no investigation could ever explain, remains unanswered. But everyone involved agreed on one detail. Whatever reached the Parker household, that October evening had known far too much to be dismissed as an ordinary wrong number, and far too little has ever been discovered to explain why the phone rang 14 years too late. In this new story, Room 12 had stood at the end of the second-floor hallway inside the Ashcroft Hotel for nearly 90 years, looking no different from the other guest rooms that lined the aging brick building overlooking the Ohio River. The hotel itself had once welcomed traveling salesmen, railroad workers, newlyweds, and vacationing families passing through southeastern Ohio during the middle of the 20th century. As interstate highways gradually replaced older travel routes, business declined until only a handful of rooms remained occupied throughout most of the year. Locals considered the Ashcroft an ordinary historic hotel struggling to survive in a town that had slowly grown quieter with each passing decade. Nothing about Room 12 attracted attention. Its door carried the same polished brass number as every other room, the wallpaper matched the rest of the second floor, even longtime employees described it as completely ordinary. Yet, among those who had worked there for many years, one uncomfortable fact quietly circulated whenever new staff arrived. The last person to enter Room 12 alone was never seen again. The story never appeared in newspapers because no crime had ever been proven. County records listed several missing persons connected to the hotel over a period of nearly 60 years, but investigators never discovered evidence linking their disappearances to a particular room. Most cases eventually became cold files after weeks of unsuccessful searches. Some missing guests were believed to have left voluntarily. Others may have encountered accidents somewhere beyond town. The hotel itself passed repeated inspections without revealing hidden passages, concealed exits, or structural abnormalities. Police officers searched every crawl space, basement wall, attic beam, ventilation shaft, and abandoned storage room several different times over the decades. Every search produced the same disappointing conclusion. Nothing inside the building explained why certain people simply ceased to exist after walking through the door of Room 12. In the spring of 2021, Daniel Mercer accepted the position of assistant manager after retiring from nearly 35 years supervising maintenance operations for a regional hospital system. Practical by nature, Daniel viewed old buildings as collections of aging mechanical systems rather than mysterious places. Plumbing leaked because seals deteriorated. Electrical circuits failed because insulation cracked. Floors creaked because wooden beams shifted with changing temperatures. Throughout his career, he had listened patiently as coworkers blamed strange sounds upon ghosts inhabiting hospital corridors built generations earlier. Every unusual event eventually revealed an ordinary explanation. That philosophy followed him into retirement, making the Ashcroft Hotel seem like an enjoyable challenge rather than an intimidating workplace. The owners appreciated his experience restoring historic buildings, hoping careful renovations might attract tourists interested in local history. The Ashcroft retained much of its original character despite countless repairs. Brass chandeliers illuminated the lobby each evening with soft amber light. Hand-carved oak staircases curved gracefully toward the upper floors, where patterned carpets muffled footsteps beneath tall ceilings trimmed with decorative plaster molding. Narrow windows overlooked the river, while antique photographs lined the hallways, preserving images of bustling streets that no longer existed outside. Daniel admired the craftsmanship immediately. Modern hotels emphasized efficiency. The Ashcroft reflected an era when builders expected structures to remain standing for generations. Every repair revealed another example of remarkable workmanship hidden beneath layers of newer materials added over decades of maintenance. During his first several weeks, Daniel noticed nothing unusual beyond the predictable challenges facing any aging hotel. One boiler required replacement before winter. Several guest rooms needed fresh paint. The freight elevator occasionally hesitated between floors because original control components had become increasingly unreliable. Occupancy remained low enough that only 8 or 9 rooms typically hosted guests on weeknights. Room 12 rarely appeared on reservation schedules, not because anyone deliberately avoided renting it, but simply because travelers preferred recently renovated rooms overlooking the river. Housekeeping cleaned it every week, regardless of occupancy. Maintenance records showed no recurring plumbing, electrical, or structural problems. If anything, Room 12 demanded less attention than almost every other room in the building. Daniel first became aware of its reputation during a routine conversation with Martha Ellison, the hotel's senior housekeeper. Martha had worked inside the Ashcroft for nearly 43 years, beginning shortly after graduating from high school. She remembered owners, employees, and guests whose names had long since disappeared from payroll records. Without drama or superstition, she advised Daniel never to enter room 12 alone after sunset if unnecessary maintenance could wait until morning. She offered no ghost stories, no exaggerated warnings, and no elaborate theories. Instead, she simply stated that every employee eventually learned the same quiet habit. Whenever work required entering room 12 during the evening, someone always accompanied them. Daniel smiled politely, assuming decades of local folklore had transformed ordinary coincidences into workplace tradition. He thanked Martha for the advice without intending to follow it. Curiosity eventually led him toward the hotel's storage archive, occupying part of the basement once used as a laundry facility. Dust-covered filing cabinets contained maintenance logs extending back to the early 1950s, along with guest registers, insurance documents, renovation blueprints, and boxes filled with forgotten correspondence. Daniel hoped to understand the building's mechanical history before beginning major restoration work. Instead, he repeatedly encountered handwritten notes attached to otherwise routine maintenance requests involving room 12. Light fixture replacements consistently carried the same instruction: never schedule after dark. Plumbing repairs included identical wording despite no explanation accompanying the request. Carpet installation records from the late 1970s listed 2 employees assigned instead of 1, even though the task required only minimal labor. None of those documents mentioned danger. They simply reflected an unusual consistency maintained across generations of hotel management. The oldest surviving guest ledger dated back to 1964. Most entries contain nothing more interesting than names, addresses, room numbers, and departure dates. One reservation, however, had been crossed out in dark blue ink. Beside the guest's name, someone had written a brief notation stating that checkout had never occurred because the occupant was officially reported missing 3 days later. Similar notes appeared only 4 more times over the following 50 years. Each involved room 12, each described individuals last confirmed entering the room alone. None contained corresponding checkout records. Daniel considered the pattern statistically unusual, but hardly impossible. Hotels occasionally became the final confirmed locations of people who later disappeared elsewhere. The documents proved only coincidence, not causation. Even so, he photocopied each page before returning them carefully to their original folders. Seeking additional information, Daniel visited the county sheriff's office, where archived case summaries remained available for historical research. Investigators had thoroughly examined every disappearance connected to the Ashcroft Hotel. Surveillance cameras installed during later years showed individuals entering the second-floor hallway, but never recorded anyone leaving room 12 afterward. Yet officers responding within minutes consistently found the room empty. Windows remained locked from the inside, the adjoining walls contained no concealed passages, fire escapes showed no signs of use. Thermal imaging, structural surveys, and repeated forensic examinations revealed nothing beyond ordinary construction. Detectives eventually exhausted every reasonable investigative technique without discovering a single clue explaining how someone could apparently vanish from a sealed hotel room. Daniel remained convinced technology, rather than folklore, would eventually solve the mystery. Historic buildings often concealed forgotten maintenance corridors, abandoned utility shafts, or undocumented renovations capable of confusing investigators. He installed new motion sensors throughout the hallway, inspected wall cavities using fiber optic cameras, measured room dimensions against original architectural blueprints, and even commissioned a laser survey comparing interior spaces with exterior walls. Every measurement matched perfectly. Room 12 occupied exactly the volume expected according to the building's design. No hidden chambers existed beneath the floor or above the ceiling. The mystery only deepened because every logical possibility quietly eliminated itself one after another. Late one October evening, a water stain appeared beneath the ceiling of room 12 after heavy rains swept across the river valley. Guests occupied neighboring rooms, making immediate inspection necessary before possible leaks spread further. Martha offered to accompany Daniel upstairs, but he declined, amused by what still seemed like an exaggerated workplace custom. Carrying only a flashlight, moisture meter, and maintenance notebook, he walked alone toward the end of the second-floor hallway. Security cameras later confirmed the time as 9:43 p.m. They recorded Daniel unlocking room 12, stepping inside, and gently closing the door behind him. That became the final confirmed image anyone ever captured of him. When Daniel failed to answer repeated radio calls 15 minutes later, hotel staff unlocked the room using the master key. They found the bed neatly made, bathroom dry, windows locked, and every light still burning exactly as Daniel had left them. His flashlight rested upright against the wall beneath the water stain. The moisture meter lay open on the carpet, displaying normal readings. His maintenance notebook remained on the writing desk with the date carefully written across the top of an otherwise blank page. Daniel Mercer himself had disappeared completely. Police searched the building continuously for 3 days. Divers examined the river. Search dogs tracked his scent only as far as the doorway of room 12 before losing it entirely. Structural engineers once again dismantled portions of surrounding walls without discovering hidden spaces or escape routes. Months later, the investigation quietly joined the same collection of unsolved cases that had accumulated for decades. The Ashcroft Hotel eventually reopened after extensive inspections confirmed the building posed no identifiable danger to guests. Renovations continued. Travelers returned. Most visitors never learned anything unusual had happened there. Employees still cleaned room 12 every week, replaced its linens, dusted its furniture, and checked its plumbing exactly like every other room. Nothing inside ever appeared disturbed. Yet one small policy changed permanently after Daniel Mercer's disappearance. Maintenance work involving room 12 could still be performed whenever necessary, but the hotel handbook now required that no employee ever enter the room alone. New staff occasionally laughed at the rule until longtime workers quietly pointed toward the framed photograph hanging inside the employee break room. Beneath Daniel Mercer's smiling portrait rested a single sentence added by unanimous agreement of everyone who had known him. It read that practical men sometimes disappear for reasons no practical explanation can ever reach. More than 3 years later, the register at the front desk still listed room 12 as available every night, but experienced employees always noticed one peculiar detail before assigning it to a guest. Somehow, despite regular reservations appearing in the computer system, the room was almost always vacant by morning, with fresh towels folded neatly inside and the bed perfectly made as though no one had entered it at all. In this new story, Black Creek Farm had stood in the same quiet valley of southeastern Kentucky for more than 100 years, long enough for generations of local families to forget exactly when it had first appeared. Surrounded by dense oak forests, limestone hills, and the narrow stream that gave the property its name, the old farmhouse overlooked nearly 200 acres of land that had once supported tobacco fields, cattle, and a thriving apple orchard. By the autumn of 2019, most of those fields had returned to wild grass, while the orchard had become little more than rows of aging trees whose twisted branches still produced fruit no one bothered to harvest. Travelers passing along County Route 46 rarely paid the property any attention. It looked like another forgotten farm, slowly surrendering to time, no different from dozens of others scattered across Appalachia. No one could have imagined that within a matter of weeks, Black Creek Farm would become the subject of conversations extending far beyond the county itself. The Carter family purchased the property shortly after retirement. Thomas Carter had spent 37 years working as an electrical engineer in Lexington before deciding he had grown tired of suburban neighborhoods and constant traffic. His wife, Margaret, had always dreamed of living somewhere quiet enough to hear birds before sunrise and watch stars after sunset without the interference of city lights. Their only son lived nearly 500 miles away in North Carolina, visiting only during holidays. leaving the couple free to begin a slower chapter of life. Black Creek Farm seemed perfect. The farmhouse required modest repairs, the surrounding land offered complete privacy, and the asking price fell well below comparable properties because the previous owner had died without immediate heirs. Nothing about the purchase suggested unusual risk. The title search came back clean. Structural inspections found only expected signs of age, and county officials welcomed the arrival of new residents to a property that had remained empty for almost 2 years. Life settled into an easy rhythm almost immediately. Every morning, Thomas walked the perimeter fence, carrying nothing more than a thermos of coffee and a notebook where he recorded maintenance projects. Margaret restored the neglected vegetable garden behind the house while cataloging dozens of heirloom flowers that continued blooming despite years of neglect. They adopted an aging border collie from a nearby shelter, naming him Jasper after the creek flowing behind the barn. The dog adapted quickly, spending long afternoons exploring the woods before faithfully returning to the porch every evening just before sunset. Friends who visited during the first month remarked that the couple looked healthier than they had in years. Retirement appeared to suit them perfectly. Black Creek Farm carried a long history, but nothing resembling the dramatic legends often attached to abandoned places. Local archives described ordinary hardships familiar throughout rural Appalachia. Floods damaged crops, harsh winters claimed livestock, young men left for military service during wartime before returning to rebuild family farms. Newspaper clippings preserved inside the county, historical museum mentioned weddings, church picnics, harvest festivals, and occasional barn fires caused by lightning. The property changed ownership only 3 times since its construction in 1918, each transfer occurring after natural deaths within the family. No murders, disappearances, criminal investigations, or unexplained tragedies appeared anywhere in the public record. If Black Creek Farm possessed secrets, they remained remarkably well hidden beneath an otherwise ordinary history. The first unusual event seemed almost too insignificant to remember. One evening, Thomas noticed every clock inside the farmhouse displaying exactly the same incorrect time. The kitchen clock, bedroom alarm clock, microwave display, antique pendulum clock inherited from Margaret's parents, and even his wristwatch had all stopped at precisely 8:17 before resuming normal operation several minutes later without requiring adjustment. As an electrical engineer, Thomas immediately suspected a brief power fluctuation. The local utility company, however, reported no interruptions affecting the surrounding area. Battery-powered devices should never have stopped simultaneously, regardless of electrical conditions. Curious but unconcerned, Thomas replaced every battery in the house anyway, quietly satisfying himself that the strange coincidence would never happen again. It happened again 9 days later. Once more, every timepiece froze at exactly 8:17. This time, Thomas observed the phenomenon directly while reading beside the fireplace. The second hand of the old pendulum clock stopped mid-swing. Digital displays remained illuminated yet motionless. His own wristwatch paused silently against his skin before continuing exactly 3 minutes later as though nothing had occurred. Outside, the wind continued moving through the trees. The fire crackled normally. Jasper lifted his head briefly before returning to sleep. Only time itself appeared to hesitate within the farmhouse. When Thomas attempted to explain the event logically, every possible explanation collapsed beneath the simple fact that several entirely different types of clocks had behaved identically despite sharing no common power source. Autumn gradually surrendered to colder evenings. Thick morning fog began settling over Black Creek before sunrise, often lingering between the orchard and the creek until nearly noon. Local residents considered the fog perfectly ordinary. Cool mountain air frequently collided with warmer water flowing through the valley, creating dense blankets of mist capable of hiding entire sections of the property. Thomas found the scenery beautiful. Margaret occasionally photographed the orchard disappearing into pale gray clouds that seemed almost solid enough to touch. Yet Jasper reacted differently. Whenever the fog drifted across the fields, the old border collie refused to leave the porch. He watched the orchard silently, ears raised, body perfectly still, ignoring every attempt to coax him outside. The behavior seemed unusual, but not alarming. Shelter staff had warned the Carters that Jasper remained nervous around unfamiliar surroundings after spending several years abandoned before his rescue. One Saturday morning, the couple decided to clear decades of overgrowth surrounding the abandoned orchard. Fallen branches, thorn bushes, and climbing vines had almost completely hidden the original stone pathways connecting each row of apple trees. While cutting away thick vegetation near the center of the orchard, Thomas discovered a narrow iron marker driven deep into the ground. Unlike ordinary survey stakes, the marker carried no numbers or property boundaries. Instead, someone had carefully engraved a single sentence across its weathered surface. Time had erased portions of the lettering, but enough remained to read the message clearly. It simply stated that some places become impossible to leave only after people forget they ever intended to go. The wording made little sense. Assuming it had been placed there decades earlier as part of some forgotten local tradition, Thomas leaned the marker against a nearby tree before continuing his work. By evening, he had completely forgotten about it. The following morning, the iron marker stood exactly where Thomas had first discovered it, driven firmly into the ground beneath untouched vines. Assuming he had simply mistaken its location the previous day, he pulled it free once again and carried it nearly a quarter-mile to the equipment shed behind the farmhouse. He leaned it against the interior wall beside old gardening tools before locking the shed for the night. Heavy rain arrived shortly after midnight. At sunrise, Thomas unlocked the shed, intending to examine the marker more carefully. It had disappeared completely. Confused, he searched every corner of the building without success. Only after returning to the orchard did he find the marker standing once again in its original location beneath the oldest apple tree on the property. Fresh mud surrounded its base, exactly as though it had never been disturbed. Thomas said nothing to Margaret. Even after decades devoted to solving practical problems, he could find no reasonable explanation for what he had witnessed. Small changes soon began affecting their daily routine in ways neither recognized immediately. Grocery trips were postponed until the following day, despite empty cupboards. Planned visits to neighboring farms quietly disappeared from the calendar. Margaret repeatedly packed overnight bags, intending to spend weekends with relatives, before unpacking everything a few hours later because leaving suddenly seemed unnecessary. Thomas delayed scheduled appointments in town for reasons he struggled to explain even to himself. Neither felt trapped, neither experienced fear. Instead, both developed a growing conviction that everything important required their presence at Black Creek Farm for just one more day. Tomorrow always seemed like a better time to leave. Tomorrow somehow never arrived. Concerned by his own behavior, Thomas returned to the county archives, searching for any mention of similar experiences involving previous owners. Most records revealed nothing unusual until an elderly volunteer produced a leather-bound ledger donated decades earlier by the family who had operated the farm throughout the 1950s. Hidden among harvest records and financial accounts appeared a brief handwritten note dated the 17th of October, 1958. The unnamed writer described repeatedly postponing a planned move to Louisville despite having already sold the property. According to the entry, every member of the household agreed each evening that departure should occur the following morning. Every sunrise brought the same decision to wait another day. Eventually, the sale collapsed because no one ever arrived to sign the final paperwork. The ledger offered no explanation beyond one unsettling observation. The writer claimed Black Creek Farm never frightened its residents. It simply convinced them they had already reached the only place they would ever truly belong. Thomas returned home carrying photocopies of the ledger, determined to discuss everything openly with Margaret. As he turned onto the long gravel driveway, he noticed something that instantly unsettled him more than any journal entry ever could. 2 packed suitcases rested neatly beside the front porch steps, exactly where Margaret had placed them earlier that morning before leaving for town. Her car, however, remained parked beneath the maple tree. Inside the farmhouse, the groceries she intended to buy had somehow already been unpacked into the kitchen cabinets, despite the fact that she had never driven farther than the end of the driveway. Margaret herself seemed genuinely surprised to discover the suitcases still waiting outside. She calmly insisted they could leave another day because nothing important existed anywhere beyond Black Creek Farm. Thomas realized he had been thinking exactly the same thing for weeks. Neither remembered deciding to stay, neither could explain why leaving no longer seemed necessary. As evening settled across the valley, every clock inside the farmhouse stopped once more at exactly 8:17. This time, neither of them reached for a watch, a telephone, or the breaker panel. They simply sat together on the porch, watching darkness spread across the orchard, while Jasper stared silently toward the iron marker standing beneath the oldest apple tree. The next morning, the mailbox overflowed with unopened letters, including notices from friends and family asking why the Carters had suddenly stopped answering every phone call. Months later, county officials found the farmhouse locked, fully furnished, and perfectly maintained. The vegetable garden remained watered, fresh firewood stood neatly stacked beside the porch, and breakfast dishes rested clean inside the drying rack. Thomas Carter, Margaret Carter, and Jasper had vanished without leaving behind a single trace. And despite years of investigation, nobody could explain what happened at Black Creek Farm.